Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of 100 Sisters on Security, where our guests speak on different areas of human security and defense as it pertains to and impacts women. We are brought to you by the Ontario chapter of the G100 Security and Defense Wing, and I'm Alison Lamb, the Ontario chair. Before we begin, I'd like to invite everyone to take a moment to consider the traditional lands they're on. I am currently on Treaty 13 lands. They're the territories traditionally stewarded by the Wendat peoples, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This interview was recorded a week after Canada Day. Although we should be proud to be Canadian, we must not forget that many of us currently live on unceded territories, those lands that were never relinquished by the Indigenous peoples to settlers. Even territories covered in treaties with First Nations, such treaties did not necessarily cede these lands to the Crown or the Government of Canada, nor were they necessarily signed with free, prior, and informed consent. So while we celebrate all that Canada has to offer, please take a moment to thoughtfully consider the traditional stewards of these lands. We have a very exciting guest with us today. Amelia Womack is a dedicated environmental and social justice advocate known for her active role in British politics. She rose to prominence as the deputy leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Amelia has been a leading force in promoting women's rights both within her own party and in society at large, actively working to eliminate obstacles for women running in elections and striving for a 50% representation of women candidates. Her contributions extend to her work on domestic violence legislation and the campaign to make misogyny a hate crime in the UK. Last year, she was one of the Global Greens delegates to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP28, with a particular focus on gender and finance. With a background in grassroots activism, Amelia has tirelessly worked on issues related to climate change, sustainability, and human rights. Her leadership and commitment continue to inspire those seeking positive change for our planet and society. Welcome, Amelia. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
So let's start with the questions. First of all, what exactly is gender responsive financing? How does it differ from gender-based financing?
So I think what's really important is that we reflect on the fact that we stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to the people throughout history that have fought for women's rights. And despite there being a lot of progress, there still is a long way to go. But we need to be ensuring that we are investing and understanding how we are creating a world where we have genuine equality, genuine equity for all genders, and ensuring that women's rights specifically are invested in to ensure that we're moving towards a society where the historic inequalities that we've experienced as women has set a standard of how we work and operate. So when we look at budgeting, it's important that we apply this to all principles of financial management, public financial management, of looking at our public services, infrastructure, social protection, to ensure that we are understanding how our decisions, our budgetary decisions, impact gender. Now, I keep thinking about this question, I keep reflecting on the 14 years that we've experienced here in the UK of the Conservative Party. We've just had an election here where we've had a huge Labour Party win, 4 Green MPs elected, which is quadrupling the number of MPs that we have. But the last 14 years of Conservative Party austerity has caused cuts in our communities. That means that domestic violence services, that childcare, that mental health support has been completely decimated. And I think when we think about how we rebuild from this point, ensuring that our budgets are looking at exactly how we invest into providing equality for women is going to be vitally important. I've got some points on this further into the podcast, because I think that while we're looking at this, the specific details of how this can work, I think it's also important to really reflect on what this looks like on an international basis, and at a time of election it is also important to reflect on how is democracy delivering for us, how is democracy delivering for women. And I think that having genuine gender-based financing is to try budgeting is to really try and ensure that we are looking at even things like accountability and transparency in the way we're working, understanding how women's well-being is a key economic driver, should be a key part of our economy, and also address those gaps in unpaid work and domestic work that women traditionally do. So throughout the G20, we have seen a real dedication to gender budgeting, and there are institutions set up in places like Morocco, Austria, Colombia to ensure that budgetary decisions that are made with gender in mind. And I think that this is an important shift, because we know that to begin with, to measure is to manage, and there are many issues that just fly under the radar because we're not genuinely understanding the impacts of our decision making. We just need to look at I brought up the cuts to the Conservatives made across the UK, and in some ways the counter to that is the Green New Deal. Now, as a huge advocate for the Green New Deal, I think it's really important that we are pushing for investment into environmental infrastructure and reducing our carbon emissions. But if this isn't budgeted in a way that understands gender, then we completely miss what an intersectional feminist future looks like when it comes to climate and the environment. And we know that we need to be, it's women that are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change and environmental destruction, and really need to be at the forefront of the solutions. So I mentioned the cuts because in many ways the Green New Deal is the counter to those cuts. It's investments into work that is traditionally male dominated, into creating infrastructure, whether that's railways or renewables, while missing out on the important work that women are doing when it comes to their day-to-day lives in communities, and really need to be embedded in ensuring that any investment into a carbon reduced future, into a climate stable future, and into securing our biodiversity, we need to be ensuring that women's rights are enshrined in that. And sometimes, even when we're talking about environmental issues, I think we miss that focus.
Thank you. You're an End Ecocide campaigner and wrote a thesis on environmental law. Why is gender responsive financing so important to environmentalism and climate change? How does the climate crisis disproportionately impact marginalized genders?
So what does climate justice look like? What does economic justice look like? What does environmental justice look like? And women need to be at the heart of that. And we see, when we provide money into the hands of women in a lot of the gender-based financing that we see through many different organizations and frameworks of just putting money back straight into women's hands, that we are seeing better solutions when it comes to problems within the climate and environment. And I think that what is important when we're thinking about ecocide, so ecocide really is, we look around the world and we see the glaciers just completely disappearing. We see our coral reefs being destroyed. We see storms hitting India and flooding. We see drought in the Horn of Africa, and we need to find a solution on how we change these things. And ecocide really is a pause button on a lot of our current environmental destruction, so that it sets a system that enables a different way of working. If we had a pause button on deforestation, I can imagine that the world of reuse and recycling would be invested in a very different way. I mean, let's just take, for example, the manufacture of clothing at the moment, with viscose being deemed as a sustainable fabric, but it is causing deforestation to try and create those fabrics. Like, I'd hazard a guess that right now we've got enough clothes in the world. In fact, a stat that I looked up last year was that we'd made enough clothes in, I think it must be 2022, to give every single person on the planet 4 new items of clothing every single month.
Right.
Yet we are causing a pollution problem, a deforestation problem, a climate problem, and it's women who are also at the forefront of this issue of this planetary crisis that we're in as well, because it's women who are having these low-paid jobs that mean they're facing poverty, that they have to choose, often choose between feeding their children and keeping a roof over their head with the small wages that they have. So these issues are incredibly interlinked. And once we understand how our environmental impacts are having not just how a new system can arise from ending that environmental destruction, then I think it will really generate new opportunities. We already see women at the forefront of many of climate solutions, and it's solutions such as in West Africa, where women are working as pastoral farmers and are now reclaiming about 70% of the land into the hands of women, so that they're continuing their traditional work and livelihoods. Or women in climate entrepreneurship in India, that means that there is investment back into women's work while creating new climate initiatives. And I think that this is, when we look at the role of ecocide, is this isn't working. So let's put a pause button on what's happening now, and it will develop new systems. And when we're looking at things like gender responsive financing, or even gender-based financing, that gives us an opportunity to see how different systems can work and operate in a sustainable way that not only keeps us below 2 degrees of warming, ends the biodiversity crisis, but ensures that we're pushing for greater equality and workers' rights for women. Because, well, I mean, what the problem is at the moment, I said that we stand on the shoulders of giants, but you just need to look around to know that the majority of the wealth, the majority of the land, and the majority of the decisions are still made by men. And this is that fundamental shift must go hand in towards better representation of women in all of those areas, must happen while we're campaigning for environmental solutions.
And I think that the importance is becoming more and more clear now, because for the first time ever at UNFCCC COP28 in Dubai featured a day specifically devoted to gender and finance. Discussed on that day were important gender-focused solutions, such as the Lima Work Program on Gender and its Gender Action Plan. What are your thoughts on the outcomes of COP28 with respect to gender and finance?
So I think what was really powerful was that there was a broader recognition that the climate change will push 158 million women and girls into poverty and limit women and girls' access to food. And for that year, I would say that I thought that the language at COP changed. It was across the board in. So for anybody who's not been to COP, there's many different things happening at the same time. There are the negotiation rooms where leaders are discussing what what they're going to get out of COP. There are several announcements that come out of them. There are the people who are kind of doing the nuts and bolts of the agreed statements from every single country of delegates that are working through every little bit of wording and deciding, what small words they can accept in the United Statements coming out of it. And then there's also, this is an opportunity for activists and civil society to, first of all, come together to communicate a lot of the issues that are shared around the world. There's a real power in hearing firsthand about the problems on the Pacific Islands at the moment, of the impacts of severe hurricanes and typhoons, and the impact that's having on their communities, their day-to-day lives, or people who have traveled to Antarctica and whose lives have changed by the loss of the ice caps that they've witnessed. There's a real power in the coming together of that. But this COP, I felt that the stories being told, many of them were about women. They were about water initiatives where money had been put in the hands of women that enabled entire communities to drink fresh, clean drinking water. It was often these stories that I think were coming out from all genders. That gender lens seemed to be a lot stronger. I felt like the language of of understanding inequality seemed to be slightly more embedded than I had seen in previous years. So I've also attended Glasgow and Egypt, but this felt like a step change in Dubai. And I think that that's the important thing to remember, though, was that was civil society. And when we look at actually where the gender representation at COP, that 34% of the delegates are women and just 19 heads of state were women. So really, women weren't part of the decision making. And I think that first small step of women's voices, achievements, and experiences being part of the narrative at the grassroots was really powerful. But I think stronger statements were needed with an understanding of how action is often already taken now, and how to best support the action that is being taken, while ensuring that there was a stronger kind of understanding about what action was needed, not just targets about what was needed.
So you mentioned that it was the civil society organizations that came up with the stronger language, the change in vision, the more embedded understanding of the disparity among genders for climate change. What about the official outcomes? How did you feel about the language coming out from the official outcomes from the decision makers, as you said?
I feel like the official language just didn't, it just didn't embrace what I was hearing at the grassroots. It didn't really kind of reflect a lot of the, it was important. So there were commitments. 198 countries did commit to a gender responsive transition. What I think that we're looking for now, and this is, to be honest, this is just the nature of COP, is where is the action? Because we know that when we come back again and look at what a gender responsive transition looks like, of trying to when countries need to update their work, that we already know they're not going to have gone far enough, fast enough. But also I didn't feel like there was the embedding in a lot of the there wasn't the same kind of embedding in how the specific actions can be taken across the board of all of these different parts of how COP operates. So we still see, COP just, it is just such a collection of everybody coming together. And I just didn't see what I saw at the grassroots reflected into the decision makers. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, because you were obviously seeing it from a very different angle. So Addison was doing an amazing job of, I don't know, with the time difference, of keeping up on top of the day-to-day, the whole story of what was coming out of COP, where it's obviously a very different perspective to when you're on the ground.
I feel like I need to invite you back for another conversation specifically on language and action, because I do tend to agree with you. I think language is one thing. With the 198 countries agreeing, the language, it was not as strong in order to get all the countries to agree. But then on top of that, you need to have language translated into action as well. And I'm just curious, maybe I'll invite you back after the next COP just to see where we're at and do this comparison of language and action once again.
Yeah. Because we just had the global stock take in Dubai, and basically that was not enough actions being taken. So
Yes. So according to UN Women, unpaid care and domestic work performed by women around the world actually has more financial value than the global tech industry. What can be done to bring more attention to this huge disparity?
it's incredible, isn't it, that there's so little value put into the day-to-day. And I speak to a lot of different people in a lot of different communities, and I sometimes think there's I knocked on a door. I can't remember where it was now. I think it was in Newport, and a woman answered the door and said, "Oh, I don't actually know that. I don't really know that much about politics. I just I just manage the house and buy the groceries, and my husband understands politics. I'll get him to speak to you." And what she meant was he came and had an opinion on the war in Ukraine and all of these kind of things that he had absolutely no influence, or, well, influence and power over through a political system, but not influence and power over on a day-to-day basis. And I felt that she was the one that was experiencing the failure of politics. She was the one that was experiencing the increased food bills with the cost of living crisis that we currently have in the UK. You know, she was talking about, you know, she was the one that was actually making the financial decisions of the household, yet this was deemed completely unimportant compared to having lofty opinions on. I feel like I'm taking away from it is important to have opinions on war, but it meant that she didn't feel like she had any agency in the household, even though she had more power than she realized. And when we degrade what women are doing and undermine it, because this has been we can't undo the hundreds of years of social norms that we have of how women have become the people who traditionally are at home doing the unpaid work and doing the domestic work as well. And it does need to be recognized as part of the economy, because when we understand how our household, the decisions are being made, how our whole household is run, and it is being traditionally run by women. It is traditionally women who are ensuring that our children are brought up, the next generation is being brought up while our older generation are supported with dignity. The fact that it is, and there's these nuances that I think are really lost in a lot of this conversation, which is the fact that if my family were unwell, it would be considered better for the economy for me to go and work to earn a salary to pay somebody else to look after my parents than it would be for me to go and look after my parents myself. Shows that there's a real disparity, there's a real gap in understanding the role of family and the role of compassion and all of those things in how the economy should look. Because you know, that if those are the choices that you have to, if those are the things that are incentivized, is actually paying for other people to care rather than maybe giving the care that you want to, then it feels like there's a real gap in how we understand how the economy works. So when we have something like a universal basic income, it means that those kinds of decisions are a lot easier to make. If people in uncared work, unpaid care, can actually care for their family members or other people and not need to make the same decisions that traditionally women need to. That if we are investing in services for those people who are going to work but are needing support for childcare, for care of the elderly and everything in between, that we are actually ensuring that that is not something that is a forcing women, traditionally women, into food poverty, into, you know, having to choose, make really tough choices about where their income goes to be able to provide and support and care for those family members. And we can look at this kind of small policy changes, so key policy changes like a universal basic income, like the flexible working, childcare, equal pay. But also I think it's really important how we understand the rebalancing of gender roles. Like, it's interesting, I read an interesting article from someone who was British but lived in Sweden, where there's equal maternity and paternity pay. And he was walking with his friends from school and his child fell over, and the child ran to him as one of his primary caregivers to cry. And his friend said, "Our children will never do that. They will always cry to their mother." And they felt that they had lost something in what it is to be a parent, because these opportunities weren't there. And I think there is a rebalancing that needs to happen of understanding the role of men in society and creating policy changes that gives an opportunity for equality to be embedded in that way. We also need to address the cultural problems. So I think there's only so far that education can go, and I think many marriages would be saved if men understood that if there's a job that a woman is doing every single day, it means that that job needs to be done, and probably they should be helping to do it. That there's should be, I think that one of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing over the years is a lot of more male role models of primary carers, as well as people doing housework. I mean, the way that the advertising industry has changed from when I was growing up, where it was always a woman washing the dishes, to it now being far more diverse, I think has been really important in challenging those social norms. But yet, ensuring that there's practical incentives. We can even kind of address labour laws, but as I always think is really important, to measure is to manage. So monitoring and research of understanding this is really important. And I think that there is so much that we don't understand about the way that we still bring up young girls compared to young boys, as if young women will be the ones who will be the primary carers and will be people who do domestic work. And I think that there is a huge cultural shift that needs to happen to secure that.
So this year, the United Nations theme for International Women's Day was Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress. There were 5 calls to action focusing on amplifying women's voices and preventing countries from cutting spending that disproportionately impact women. And I think you touched a little bit upon that already. What can we do to answer this call?
So I think that I would actually like to talk about how we best support equality for women, because it's not just decision makers that have this job. We do need to be ensuring that we use our political power to secure better representation, to secure all of those things that I mentioned before, where men still dominate in positions of power. Yes, we need to be ensuring that we're using our political power to ensure better gender balance. But when we think about platforming women, I think that it's really important that we remember our day-to-day activities, because I know that I wouldn't be where I am now if it wasn't for incredible women that have supported me. And when we look at decision makers, we know that our political institutions are dominated by men. Like, we know that it takes women multiple times to be asked to stand for election, and it will take support of so many people for them to overcome the barriers as to why they don't stand. We know that women tend not to apply for jobs because they think that they're not going to, that big women will apply for jobs where they hit all of the criteria, where men only apply for jobs when they hit, I've had different ranges of this, from 50% to 70%. And so there are many small things that I think that we need to remember, and how we enable and support women in the day-to-day, which will have rippling impacts into these major institutions in other ways. And even things like, I think, I've been in many meetings where I feel like there's a term called heap eating, where I've definitely been heap eated. So heap eating is where you put an idea out there, and then a man later in the meeting repeats the idea, and then everyone's like, oh, that was a great idea. And you're just sat there. Lots of women are sat here realizing how often this happens to them. It might have happened to them today. You're sat in the meeting like, did I say that loud enough? Maybe I didn't word it properly. And it's kind of so quite often, even when I have like good ideas, I message other women in the room and like, I think this is a good idea. Can you back me up? And it's really incredible how you can create, when you're supporting women in your day-to-day life, and understanding how small actions can start to undo a little bit some of the patriarchal structures that we have, that I think that you can create much bigger waves further down the line.
I love that idea that you just offer to us about like deconstructing the patriarchy by gathering support separately. But it almost seems like, why is it necessary to do that extra work in order to basically almost campaign for your own ideas, when, as you said, with the heap eating, a man at the exact same table can say the exact same idea and not even, it probably thought that they came up with it on the top of their heads, not realizing that they had heard it from you several minutes before. Meanwhile, before you bring that idea out, you have to pre-plan, you have to campaign, you have to gather support beforehand. All that extra work.
And it's it's when you're battling against the system that is weighted against you. And I think that, I've spoken to a lot of men who don't see these problems in their day-to-day lives. And I think that actually the patriarchy isn't just about the shift in how men work and operate. It's a shift in women understanding their own voice and power as well, because we're all complicit in our own way in how patriarchy works, because it's our dominant culture, and there are things that we understand and ways that we feel about ourselves in the world that have been taught to us for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that is very hard to undo. So yes, it's a lot of work, but if we don't undo it now, then we condemn future generations to being stuck in this same rut. And as we're kind of, shining a light on some of the problems that we have, I think as I said, yes, we need to be we need to be challenging the big structures, our governments, the UN, on how they do better, hold them to account for the promises that they've made, ensure that they're taking action. But remember that we have our own power and day-to-day actions that we can take that ensure that there's a genuine shift in how we move and operate in the world.
Well, that's all our questions for today. Thank you so much, Amelia, for sharing your extremely important work with us. This discussion on gender equity has been an impactful edition of 100 Sisters on Security, and I hope our viewers and listeners will join us again next time.
Thank you so much, Alison.
Thank you.